Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week, we're back to continue part 2 of the conversation with Professor Johnson and the exploration of hip-hop culture. Tune in.
Yeah. No, good point. One of the things you mentioned earlier, I wanted to drill down more into is you were talking about DEI and critical race theory, these things that have become such buzzwords that, to your point, are indicating Black. And so it's been particularly polarizing and interesting, for a lack of better words, to see how mainstream media and certain politicians have been utilizing these terms to galvanize groups of people who are essentially, to your point, anti-Black culture. As we think about education to that point, what we're seeing with DE&I, specifically at higher ed, in the SCOTUS decision last year around admissions, and what's your thoughts being in higher ed as it relates to being someone who's pushing for a culturally responsive education? And I assume, and we'll get into kind of what you're currently studying, but like your whole work is in this area and in this field that feels like it's currently under attack. And how are you feeling about it? How do you position yourself in that?
You mentioned authenticity earlier. I don't know how to be nobody else but me. Like, I feel like I'm the same 18-year-old you met on the set. I just got older.
Yeah.
I evolved as a person, of course, like we all do, or I hope we all did, but
You'd be surprised, but yes, we all should be evolving for sure. So,
essentially I'm the same person, particularly when it comes to the culture. I've always represented it, and, why wouldn't I use it in the classroom? But as far as my position, there's several ways we can look at it.
mhm,
And the hallmark of the American educational system is the heroic aspect, fighting the Revolutionary War to free itself from the tyranny of Great Britain, and fighting the Civil War, ending slavery, and World War I and World War II, and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And my parents are soldiers. My sister is a soldier. I'm the black sheep that went to college. But as you know, 9/11 happened our senior year.
yeah.
So I'm sitting here, and when your parents are in the Army, you always think about maybe joining the Army
mhm,
because it's the lifestyle that you're used to. You're going to travel. But most importantly, and I think this is why a lot of black people join the Army, is we know they're going to pay for school. And that wasn't always afforded to us. After World War II, government began giving the GI Bill. Are you aware of GI Bill? Was given to soldiers to assist with their college education.
I am, but I'm glad that you went on ahead and explained it for our listeners because we don't
Okay.
like to make assumptions around here. But yes.
Right. Well, that was not offered to black soldiers. That was only offered to white soldiers.
Yeah.
And that contributed to the white flight out of New York City that enabled these soldiers to go to the suburbs, get these houses with low mortgages, and make the property value in the city plummet, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, black areas are not going to get the assistance that's needed for them to thrive at all. So the GI Bill being issued contributed to the genesis of hip hop culture as far as New York City is concerned. But to take it back to the military lifestyle and 9/11 and trying to bring it all full circle, there's a certain type of information that they want you to learn from age 5 to 18 in order to continue that narrative, right?
mhm,
So anything that is counter to that narrative is going to be ostracized. And hip hop is a counterculture. Hip hop's not the first counterculture. A lot of the criticism of hip hop is the content regarding drugs, but it's like people were selling dope before hip hop culture.
Right.
A lot of the 60s and 70s pop scene was drug songs by some great artists, the Beatles, great bands, Jefferson Airplane. White Rabbit, that's a song about drugs. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is a song about drugs. Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze. So whenever something is not going along with the agenda, it's going to get attacked.
Mhm.
And obviously, they're aware of the strides that Black Americans had been making. So that we've got to put an end to that. And to me, the current plan is to attack educational institutions in order to facilitate that. And Florida is the state that we're going to try the most radical things ever to see if we can get it popping in our area as well.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation of
Yeah.
it. And I know that's very simple terms. We can get into the data, we can get into the chronological timeline of these things in a later date, but I think that for the most part, everyone's aware of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And so I appreciate your response, which is just still staying authentic. But to add to that, my question would be what, if any, differences are you seeing at the higher education level as it relates to culturally responsive curriculum,
Well,
pedagogical instruction?
again, these terms take on a life of their own depending on whose hands they're in.
Fair.
Uh, what I don't want to do is make it succinct to, like we know racism is systematic.
Mhm.
So it's inherent that that would occur within school systems as well. For
Mhm.
example, I've been teaching at the collegiate level since 2011. But when I relocated to Atlanta, you know, you don't want to move to Atlanta with no job. You know what I'm saying? There's a limited amount of money you can make as an educator. So unfortunately, that idealism versus capitalism, again, saving the babies and saving the world versus getting money, that came into play. So I was like, I'm going to make this transition into the tech world, but I'll combine education and tech to maintain that connection. And that's why I'm so thankful for the faculty fellowship with the Propel Center, because it enables me to do that, specifically with HBCUs. I feel that there's a space for what they're terming urban education as a whole, but there's a lot of subdivisions underneath that, culturally responsive education being one,
Right.
and utilizing hip hop as that culture specifically. What if the majority of the students in your area are of Latino descent, they're Mexican? Well, you will want to make sure that their school environment is one that is respectful and acknowledges their home culture.
Mhm.
And it's the same thing with us. So anything that they feel is not aligned with the mother culture, they're going to shun. So you can learn about Martin Luther King, but you can't learn about Martin Luther King when he moved from civil rights to human rights. You can learn about the Civil War and it freeing slavery, but you can't learn too much detail about Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 and the Tilden Hayes Compromise and Jim Crow. Like, we don't want you to know everything that was going on in between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. We're going to block that out.
Yeah.
So you can learn about Africa, but instead of talking about slavery in the books, we're going to say agricultural workers migrated from Africa, because in order to maintain our heroic narrative, we have to absolve ourselves of the heinous, atrocious acts that we have committed throughout history.
You bring up a good point. I definitely think there's a desire to your point, maintain sort of a heroic narrative. But when we think about a lot of the other larger global atrocities, the first one that comes to mind to me is the Holocaust, right? And so I have not been to Germany, but my understanding is when it comes to the Holocaust, like there's so much acknowledgement of the Holocaust in Germany and like to monuments to just all of these things. And my initial reaction to that is because they have a desire to not forget, they have a desire to not continue to do that thing. And I feel like, unlike Germany, part of America does not have a desire to no longer do that thing. So that's why they don't want to acknowledge history, because they want to continue to repeat it in different ways. And so, to your point, I think that's why they don't want people to learn about it. Because then it's going to be like,
Well,
oh, that sounds familiar. That kind of feels
well,
like what's happening right now.
teaching at a historically Black university versus teaching at a predominantly white institution, even using hip hop, is going to be absorbed differently. And if I'm speaking about hip hop being a cultural, artistic response to socioeconomic oppression, I have to mention, some of these atrocities that the dominant culture has perpetuated and has supported and has sustained against Black people.
Yeah,
And when you're talking about it at a age, it's being absorbed differently at a predominantly white institution. And therefore, my student evaluations are polarized.
I'm sure. I am sure.
There is no middle. It's either, oh my God, I'm learning so much. Oh man, I listen to music completely differently now. I watch movies differently now.
Yeah.
That's one pole. And then the other end of that is, he's making me feel guilty for being white, which is not my intention. It's never my intention for anyone to feel guilty or shameful for knowing the truth. But as a truth teller and a truth seeker, it's incumbent upon me to share that truth. And, if you're going to take it a certain type of way, particularly having guilt, that just means you have a conscience, right?
Right. Yeah.
You, you know something's wrong.
Yeah.
You know that.
Mhm.
So it's just a shoot the messenger type of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that it seems, at least high level. Again, I haven't been super deep in it, but it seemed like that's the concern and that's the narrative is for certain white people feeling uncomfortable about the idea of what was done. And it's like, you should, right? Because that, to your
Right.
point, that's just like having a conscience. Like, even when we think about what's going on in Gaza and all these, it's about
Right.
having a conscience. It's not
But if you speak against what's going on in Gaza in a certain manner, you might be accused of being anti-Semitic.
fair, right? So it's just interesting to me the thought process that people can't be uncomfortable. But says who, right? It's okay to be uncomfortable. You're stretching and you're learning, and so it's not that anyone is pointing the finger and saying, "Hey, you 18-year-old Bobby, you're responsible for slavery." But don't you want to know what happened? So don't you want to be aware to maybe
No, ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is bliss. Of course, I don't want to know. Of course, I'd rather go on as if this is not going on. Of course, I'd rather live in the fantasy world. We live in a surveillance state right now, but we don't look at it like that.
Yeah, but it definitely is.
And they're doing the whole educational thing, but they're doing DEI in the workplace too. So
Yeah,
the attack is multifaceted. It's on several battlefields.
yeah,
It's silent wars being fought every day.
absolutely. And to that point, what are your thoughts about what we as a community, but even if you don't want to put that broad stroke on it, how are you working to combat some of these? To your point, these are systematic attacks. And what should we be thinking about collectively when it comes to combating this? Thinking about how far we've come, but it feels like how much further we need to go, or how much the systems are trying to turn us back to where we were versus the progress that we thought we were making.
Well, and that's the thing. It always appeared like we were making progress,
Mm,
because people look at the increase in, black wealth over a particular period of time as, oh, we moving on up. But as we know, there is no real middle class.
right.
Like, you know, you're either working to survive or you're not. And there's a small percentage of those controlling, everyone else that do. I say that to agree with you in the sense that we need to know what are our goals. What are our goals as a community? We can't even see eye to eye on certain things. Our mental health is in disarray. That's generational. We have different cultural values based upon, again, our backgrounds. We see things differently. Our interpersonal interactions with one another sometimes is horrible. We don't do right by each other sometimes. And whether that's within our individual relationships or in our collective relationships as leaders, there's things that we talked about earlier, how we don't like to discuss certain things in the Black community, but leadership is something that needs to be discussed
Yeah.
because I was in Chicago last week and I was speaking to this lady that was a member of the Black Panther Party. And we talked about when Eldridge Cleaver went to Algeria and established diplomatic relations between the party and nations over there. But we don't have any true leadership over here. We got faces and names that are attributed to being Black leaders, but do we really trust them? Does our generation even believe in the leadership of the elders anymore?
Mhm.
Because a lot of times they think we're too progressive. And specifically, culturally responsive education is looked at in that manner because, everybody Black don't like hip hop. And,
We're not a
you know,
monolith.
we're
Just
not a
say what people
monolith. We're
say,
not a
right?
monolith. Again, we're coming from different backgrounds. So, you hear hip hop and you just start thinking cuss words and guns and sex and violence instead of looking at the reasons why this type of subject matter exists, which is what I explore within that global mass communication class. What's being said in the lyrics and why it's being said. But, as long as we're looking at each other in a particular manner, I'm looked at in a particular way because I got locks.
Yeah.
And that's not just by the dominant culture. That's us,
Yeah,
you know,
everybody. Yeah.
looked at in a particular way because I wear Jordans to class. Because when you're modeling yourself after the dominant society, you subscribe into cultural imperialism. And I'm not finna do that to appease any of you. I'm sorry to say it like that, but that's just the reality of the situation. I always tell my students to seek counsel from the elders, but I also tell them that they got to be qualified. The wisdom of the elders is needed to guide the strength of the youth.
Yeah.
But everybody older than us ain't wise. There's a lot of old fools too. And you have to be cognizant of that. And I'm very much cognizant of that because of just what I've seen and experienced dealing with us and dealing with them.
Yeah. Fair point. You brought up a lot of really good points there, things that we need to keep in mind. And you talked about a lot of things in terms of how hip hop, the work that you're doing at least intersects the things that we look at within this podcast, right? There's race, obviously a lot of wealth to your point, like hip hop sort of being originating out of white flight and the disintegration of New York City specifically and all of the challenges that happen there with wealth. But tell me as we think to the future what you're working on. I know that you're working on your doctorate, but tell our listeners what your research is and how that intersects with the current work that you're doing.
Okay. Well, I'm a culturally responsive educator or a hip hop educator more specifically. And again, I'm not trying to be pigeonholed. I'm across the communication space. I taught multicultural marketing communication at Florida State. I do multicultural marketing communications consultants. And I also try to stay connected to journalism as well because I got that writing and editing and content creation skill set as well. But I don't want to be just a hip hop guy. I'm way more than that. It's just what is garnering a lot of the media coverage in recent years.
It's
So,
touchy. And to
yeah,
your point, it's something that permeates everything, right? So,
yeah, it permeates all facets of society. One thing that I have done is develop a hip hop culture interdisciplinary studies minor, 18 credit hours, 6 3 credit hour courses. I'm refining it as we speak. I'm hoping that it can be implemented at several institutions as opposed to just one.
that's awesome.
That's one thing I'm doing. My doctoral research, again, as a culturally responsive teacher, you understand its importance, you understand its application, you understand the backlash. So while I've been utilizing it in higher education, my research is K through 20. I'm also exploring it at the high school level, and my dissertation research specifically is urban high school leaders, principals and assistant principals, hip hop culture, and culturally responsive leadership. I actually got a book written by Muhammad Khalifa, and he's a culturally responsive education scholar, came into his research during the coursework aspect of the program. But part of that backlash is getting leadership buy-in. So it's necessary to explore how school leaders feel about hip hop culture.
Mm.
Bakari Katwana, within his research, labels the hip hop generation as those being born in between 1965 and 1984. So if you were born in 5, that means in 2025, you turn 60.
Mhm.
If you were born in 4, that means this year you're turning 40. My research is more or less saying there's multiple hip hop generations because you can't say that because you were born in 85 and 86 that you didn't experience culture. You know what I'm saying? I can't say that you're part of a completely different generation when you were born just 1 or 2 years after me.
Right.
But the research is about finding out how school leaders feel about hip hop. Well, how do you feel about it being in your classroom? Are you recruiting culturally responsive educators? And most importantly, what do you know about hip hop? What's your relationship with it?
Mm.
Jay-Z was born in 1969. Pac was born in 71, Big was born in 72, Nas was born in 73. So if you were born in 73 and you turned 50 last year and you are a principal or an assistant principal, you are very much acquainted with their era of hip hop in the mid 1990s
Yeah.
because Pac was 25 when he passed in 96. So if you were in your early to mid 20s and you're in a educational administration position right now, you have a relationship with hip hop culture, whether it's you listen to it or you may have been a practitioner of one of the elements.
Hmm.
And again, a lot of teachers are artists and a lot of educational leaders were artists as well. So I'm hoping, and of course, research is succinct to the sample that you're using,
Yeah.
but I'm certain that the results of the study can be generalized to a lot of Black urban high school leaders as far as even the culture being accepted in the hallway. Like a lot of times what Khalifa terms as hip hop students, they're disciplined more often
Mhm.
just based off of what they're wearing, based off how they're speaking, cause when I was teaching 10th grade, my youngins, they gonna cuss. Like you thought you could cuss. Mine, they gonna show you how it's done. So that you have to just block out that they're cussing because everybody would be getting suspended. It's kind of being able to except that the baby's gonna be dropping F-bombs every now and you're just gonna have to deal with that, particularly if it has no effect on their ability to think critically and to pull themes out of whatever is the source that you're reading from and being able to write about it in a
Right.
you that's all day in my class. I'm not worried about that. But a previous generation of Black people might be more worried about that
Yeah.
than your actual absorption and application of the skills and information that you learning in class.
Mhm.
And that mind state has to change in education because
Yeah.
the students have changed. They've come up differently. And just like how politics and technology shaped hip hop culture, it is also shaping the world that they're growing up in on a larger scale.
Absolutely. And what once worked will not necessarily work
Will not work.
before.
I hate when teachers say these kids ain't like they used to be. Then why haven't you changed how you taught?
Right.
Instead of making them making
Right.
them acquiesce to what you want.
Absolutely.
You the
Yeah.
minority.
And
And
conform.
that's the humility that it takes to be an educator nowadays. You have to be able to change who you are and what you thought because it's not about you. It's about them.
Yeah. I remember, to your point, during my doctoral journey, one of my professors had us listen to a speech, and I want to say it was by fellow FAMUan Ibram Kendi, and he was giving a speech to some doctoral students when he was teaching at UF, and it was telling them and challenging them on the importance of always being an intellectual. And so what you said reminded me of that in the sense that you have to, especially as an educator, I'd love to see everybody do it, right? To just think critically and be open to the idea that what you think you know may or may not be true anymore.
Right.
But the idea of being intellectual is just being willing to challenge your thought processes. And I
Yes.
agree that anyone in leadership and in education has to be, because especially nowadays you're managing multiple generations. And so the
Mhm.
idea of being an intellectual, being willing to learn different things and rethink the way that you have experienced the world and
Mhm.
understand that there are different viewpoints, especially in education, right? To your point, you're shaping this new generation. You have to recognize and acknowledge
You
that
have
their
to be
world is completely different than the
yes.
world that you grew up in.
And you have to be aware of what they're going through.
Yeah.
As a young professor at our alma mater, I always had a pulse of what was going on
Yeah.
outside of the classroom.
Yep.
Had a strong understanding of the issues, whether it's food insecurity or housing insecurity or just decisions being made outside the classroom. And then teaching at the high school level, when you're 15, 16 years old, you on that cusp of thinking you grown, but you ain't grown. And there's times where you want to be an adult and there's times where you want to be acting like a child.
Mhm.
But the emotions are all over the place. And that's where social emotional learning comes in, teaching them to be aware of those emotions and being able to feel them and not react in a negative manner. And at the same time, having empathy for others. I think even in adulthood, if we knew what other people were going through, we would be more considerate of one another. And I think that
Yeah.
it starts with building those habits at a young age. And
Mm.
the fact is, a lot of people have been inconsiderate assholes for the vast majority of their life, and they're unwilling to take accountability for it.
Yeah. They haven't had to, right?
Right.
The consequence hasn't been great enough to force them to want to take accountability. But yeah, this has been really good. What do you want listeners to take away from this conversation? Like what is your hope?
Take something. Like, I don't know. You never know your effect. Like, I'm just thankful that you felt I was interesting enough to interview. You know, and I'm humbled at that. So, like, damn, somebody wants to hear what I have to say about a topic. So I'm
I
hopeful.
appreciate that. But when we link all the things that you've done and all of the research and presentations that you've done, it's not odd that I would ask you to come on the podcast. So he's just being humble, guys, listeners, just so you know.
Well,
But
I mean, listen, you never know. Again, people look at the culture differently. And I can recall, situations where, again, I taught journalism, and I've never said this publicly. A student, they wanted to write an article on me, and the professor was like, well, what? He ain't did nothing. What he done? You know what I'm saying? So that's the type of energy that, and unfortunately, you take those experiences and you don't want to apply them to the general aspect of life, but you know that that sentiment exists. You know that there's people out there that feel this way. It ain't gonna stop me from doing what I'm doing.
because
But
there's always going to be someone who's looking
yeah,
up to you, and then there's always going to be someone
yeah,
who's looking down just based
yeah,
on positionality. And so that
yeah,
conversation is always going to be relative to me. Like there's always somebody who's going to be like, "Oh my god, you've done so many amazing things," and somebody who's like, "You're just getting started,"
right,
based on
right,
like where
yeah,
they are in life and
yeah,
everything
yeah.
else.
I mean, I'm hopeful that people understand that there's a space for hip hop in the educational realm. I'm hopeful that everybody understands the interconnection between culture and commerce, and that there's always a bigger picture, and be aware of what you're listening to and what you're watching. The brain is a visual organ, so whatever it absorbs,
Yep.
subconsciously it's going to be there. And just the effects of media and the information that you consume and the type of information that you consume. And we spoke about journalism nowadays. When I taught news writing and reporting, we read in the same news story as CNN was supposed to be in the middle, NBC, which leans to the left, and Fox, that leans to the right. And we're going to see what vocabulary they're using, how the message is being presented,
Mm.
and we're going to deduce what audience these messages were made for. So I just want people to think critically about everything, really and truly, because hip hop is connected to everything. Like I said, it's an interdisciplinary studies program that I developed. These classes can be taught in departments of history. They could be taught in your educational department. They can be taught in your criminal justice department. I got a law case study class that's speaking on Uncle Luke and Two Live Crew's trial,
Yeah, I remember that. Mhm.
which is big with censoring. And even now, more recently, Young Thug's lyrics being used as evidence against him
I
in a
saw that.
RICO trial. So these are things that, College of Music, School of Business and Industry. Why would you not have a hip hop and entrepreneurship based class utilizing Jay-Z's business portfolio as the foundation for class products? I taught an intro to PR class, and it was a large class. So I separated them into groups, and I had them create a strategic integrated marketing communications plan based upon a duet album between Jay-Z and Beyonce. And that was before the Carters came out, like
Interesting.
way, way before. This is documented.
Because you're a visionary, or
I'm
did
not saying that.
someone push you from the
I'm
inside?
not saying that. What I'm saying is it was only practical to do that with the buying power of both. It was a business move on top of an artistic move, on top of it being symbolic of Black love and Black union.
Yep.
But also it was another example of using hip hop in the classroom
Yeah.
in a way that's interesting to the students. They like, oh, we all over that. SWOT analysis, the executive summary, all of that. All because you using Hove and B in class.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Any recommendations of any tools or resources? I know you mentioned earlier, and I'll make sure to include these couple of books you mentioned. I think Frames of Mind and the Hip Hop Wars. Anything else that you?
I got like a stack of books on my count. I'm gonna say Know Thyself
Okay.
by Dr. Naeem Akbar. It talks about what knowledge is
Mm.
and how we obtain it and what's considered knowledge to us versus the dominant culture. It references that narrative and maintaining it that we spoke of. There's a term in there called deconstruction.
Mhm.
When we deconstruct some of these things that we've absorbed, whether it's their history
Yeah.
or whether it's their religion,
Mhm.
which is a big thing,
Yeah.
and an entirely different conversation regarding our relationship with God and spirituality and what we created, what was given to us. And again, how we commune with God and our relationship with God informs how we feel about the world. Like I said, we got different values
Yeah.
and religion plays a big part in that. So,
I love that.
no,
I'm
no,
gonna make a mental note of that book for myself because that sounds
for sure.
very,
Let's
very insightful.
see if I got something else for you. For educators, if you're looking for scientifically based information to back your studies, the effects of culturally responsive teaching on the brain. When you're activating those creative faculties, STEM has changed to STEAM.
Yeah.
It's not just science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now there's that A for arts in there because the research indicates that when you participate in arts programs, your science and math scores are going to increase.
I could see that.
And the hip hop is innately connected, inextricably linked to STEM. Just even with Grandmaster Flash inventing the crossfader, and this episode of the Netflix documentary series Hip Hop Evolution, in which they're telling his story, and it's obvious that had he had an opportunity to go to college, he may have been an electrical engineer. But again, hip hop is not looked at in a genius manner because when we think of intelligence, we think of it by the mother culture's definition. And that's why Gardner's book Frames of Mind is so important because it looks at multiple intelligences
Yeah.
and the ways that they're portrayed in life.
Yeah.
And hip hop portrays it with each element.
And I just want to clarify because you said a couple times mother culture slash dominant culture. What culture are we talking about? Just so folks
When,
aren't watching.
when I say the dominant culture, I'm talking about the culture that surrounds us, that
Eurocentric white culture, the
that
origin of
suffocates us, that when I've been taking students to Africa, along with my friend and colleague, Dr. Christopher Daniels, it's important to understand that racism in the global white structure, it's global white supremacy. It's not just here.
yeah, the
And
slave trade happened all over the world. That was not
man,
in
you know,
America versus
the
Africa.
scramble for Africa. That's what I want people to take. The scramble for Africa, where they sat down at the Berlin conference and decided how they were going to divide up the continent amidst themselves. And just even the history. I spoke about that heroic narrative in escaping Britain. We were 13 colonies before we were 13 states. Well, Ghana is a British colony. Nigeria is a British colony. And South Africa at one time was controlled by both the British and the Dutch. So when we look at it from that perspective, we could see that colonization ain't succinct to America. It's a global thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we close out, social links. What's the best way for folks to connect with you?
I'm at my government name on LinkedIn and Facebook, and I'm at Nova the Professor on Instagram. I also have an organization called HBCUS, Historically Black Communications for Undergraduate Students. So I'm at Historically Black Communication on Instagram. And I also have a hip hop based consulting agency called the IMC firm. IMC as in integrated marketing communications, but also IMC as in I'm a practitioner of the emceeing element of hip hop culture. So that's the word IEYEMCEMM, excuse me, EMCEE firm. So I got 3 pages on the gram. We working on TikTok and YouTube. It's only 24 hours in the day. So I'm hopeful that soon I can get my social media content game up in order to maximize visibility of everything I got going on.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to it. And again, thank you so much for this conversation. I really
Thank
appreciate
you
you.
for having me again. I
Before
appreciate
I fully close out, I usually ask people to leave me with like a quote. But in your case, I'm going to ask maybe it doesn't have to be favorite, but at least like your top of mind go to rap lyric that you often replay or feel like has become a quote for you.
the quote. This is a quote I live by because, everybody likes to debate. And when you're getting your PhD, it's based on analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So, and it affects you as a person because, and you know this because you got your doctoral degree, it affects how you converse with other people because they can't offer you shallow information to back up their points. You have to bring evidence to support why you feel the way you feel.
Fair.
Because they saying, well, I feel this way. It don't matter how you feel. Tell me what you know. There's no feelings in truth. A large amount of faith don't make anything true. What do you know? Don't tell me what you believe in. So it's a quote by John Henrik Clarke, and it goes, I only debate amongst my equals. Everyone else I teach. And that's how I feel as far as a quote to go by in life. Now, if you ask it for a specific rap lyric, I'm going to go with people fear what they don't understand, hate what they can't conquer. Guess it's just a theory of man. And that's Nas from Hate Me Now. Because I believe that too. Like people fear what they don't understand.
Absolutely.
The opposite of love ain't hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, thank you, Professor Johnson. Again,
Thank
this
you for
is an
having me, Dr.
interesting
Morris.
conversation.
Thank you
Uh,
for having me, Doc. I hope to join you soon.
you will, future Dr. Johnson. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Likewise. Take care.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.